Material for the brain. Conversations for thinking bodies. In this show, together with our guests, we explore different ways in which we can develop a meaningful relationship with our bodies and minds and respond to the current state of the culture in a quest for more integrated and embodied perspectives. Hello and welcome to Material for the Brain podcast. In today's episode, which is a continuation of this short series of conversations in times of crisis, I have invited Shady Greis, who is a dance artist from Salzburg, who was born in Egypt. And during the last few weeks, we had several exchanges in Facebook over our different political positions. And we have agreed to talk together, and we wanted to not to speak directly about what is happening, but more to explore our backgrounds and histories as a person who grew up in Egypt versus a person who grew up in Israel, and how do we understand the tension between the different identities that are composing the current situation of being an Arab, being Egyptian, being a Jewish person, being an Israeli. And to dive into that, it has been a really wonderful conversation that really opened my mind to the different things that I was completely ignorant towards. And we also managed to dive a little bit into our shared background as dance artists, and how do we perceive dance in relation to politics and to activism, and what are we aiming to do in the world. So I hope you will enjoy this conversation, and without further ado, here is Shady Greis. Hello, Shady. Welcome to my podcast. How are you, my friend?
Hello, Matan. Thanks for inviting me to your podcast. I'm so happy to be here and excited.
Yes, this is I'm excited too, and I just wanna say that I really appreciate the fact that you were willing to dive into this conversation with me. I know that in the beginning you had some hesitance about this, and yeah, I really appreciate the willingness to dive into this conversation. And I just wanted to start checking a little bit, like, just how are you, my friend? How are you amidst all these things that are happening in the Middle East? I'm just wondering, how do you feel right now, and what's going on with you?
Yeah, I didn't take it easy at the beginning. It was a bit very intense for me, because it was not the idea that it's happening in the Middle East. It was the idea that that's the first time I have a certain intense events happening there, and I am in Central Europe, where I see how people here perceive the events. And through this, I understood more how they perceive me. And that was a bit intense, emotional revelation, that you see, okay, even if you spoke to me as Shady and everything, if you have like a connection together, but still there are many assumptions and expectations and stuff that you are an Arab person, and in these situations you have an assigned team and an assigned expectation, and that was a bit emotional, intense to feel when I am here.
Could you maybe, I'm very curious about what you just started to say. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit? What was your feeling about how your surrounding experienced the conflict? And maybe can you also share with me a little bit, like, what is your surrounding? I know you're like you live in Salzburg. You're still studying in the Salzburg
Yes.
Academy of Dance. Okay, so your surrounding is this kind of international dance artist.
No, I
you
was
could
kicked
say, or
out
like.
of 1 year ago. So
Okay, another
yeah, so
story.
I am
Okay,
not in scene anymore. That's a very interesting
okay,
story, and maybe it's for a different episode. But
okay.
yeah. But maybe, like, I would also like to give like you choose. I can give a brief about my surrounding here in Salzburg, and I can also start the story from the beginning about my perception in Egypt towards the situation in Israel or Palestine. I can go for both. Which one do you want me to start?
Let's maybe I'm just curious a little bit like on what is happening now, and then I'm happy to we start going back into our more like early stories where we grew up in the Middle East.
So like in May 2022, I got expelled from Seed, but I stayed in Salzburg for visa issues and for I had some projects going on. And in Salzburg, I am engaged with some leftist groups. So I am trying to be politically active there. I am also a volunteer for the last year in a community autonomous space in Salzburg. So I was really, or I'm always between some people who are usually politically active, specifically leftist. Was trying to have some artistic projects in Salzburg and outside Salzburg. So I had some projects in Vienna or in Berlin or in Salzburg. So also I have some, so I am like 2 feet, one in a political realm and one in an artistic realm. Plus, Salzburg as a very, let's say, a bit conservative city in Austria, but also have a huge international student and tourism atmosphere. So that is more or less where
and
I
what
am
was it and how did you experience the people around you perceiving the situation, and kind of because and you said that kind of it affected how you could understand yourself or how they relate to you, so could you elaborate on that?
Yes. So usually, like, to be honest, for me, having something happening in Palestine and Israel, having some attacks or war, it's not a new thing. That is more or less an everyday going situation in my region, that we are always aware of these things happen. But I perceived, like, when I was talking about many, let's say, intense political things happening in the Middle East, that the space that people around me here also they are very politically active and aware is a bit different. So for example, when I'm talking about Sudan as something I'm really affected with, it is for them, yeah, that's something sad happening over there. So it is very far. The same thing when the events on 7th of October and the attack and what happened and all of this situation, I think that there was this wave of attention because it was outside the usual victims. Like, it is not like people are always expecting, Hamas had some missiles, some attacks, Israel is replying, and they have some bombings, and that's it. Hezbollah is doing some stuff, Israel is replying, or the opposite, Israel is doing some stuff, Hezbollah is replying, and it is a war zone very far over there. We can be humanitarian about it, we can have opinion or whatever, but we are not so affected. But recently there was this idea that we are seeing in the news people who look like us are being harmed, people who are in a music festival that we go usually for a side trance music that we listen to it here and party here are being attacked. So there is this idea of they were affected, like they were attention, not because it is happening there, but because it's personally relatable to them. And the other things are not personally relatable to them.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's clear or not.
No, it's very clear. So if I understand you correctly, so kind of sense, let's say, Israel maybe represents something that is a little bit more similar to Western culture, even though I would say it's not really. It has a lot of differences than the typical European countries, but still, on the surface, it seems as something that people could relate to. So then they express their interest in him, and is that kind of what you meant?
And Yes, that's what I meant, because it's not only about like maybe similar culture, but also like we meet Israel usually. Like for example, if we talk about dance scene, yeah, there are a lot of Israeli people in the dance scene, a lot of organization, a lot of companies, a lot of it's part of the scene. If you talk about like economy, culture, parties, or night scene, that is you have people that you met and can relate with, while you will never meet Palestinian people in these scenes, for example, for many reasons, or less Arab people in these scenes for many reasons. So for the usual, or like let's say the mainstream European opinion, that is different. There are people we can relate to more. And I think it's amazing, but it just raised the other question about, okay, what about the rest?
Yeah,
What
I
about the
always
other
have this
things that happen
question
here?
as well. I also
Yeah.
have this question as well. It's a little bit tricky to ask it kind of as an Israeli, because it can be perceived as if I would prefer people to just mind their own business. Uh, but but again, like if you don't take this cynical approach, I am really wonder why. For example, in Syria, there was like a horrible civil war with more casualties than the entire history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over 100 years. In I don't know how much, in a period of like 2 years, and you haven't seen any demonstration, any public interest. Nobody was kind of marching against the genocide in Syria, and I don't know. Do you have any?
No, it
So
is
so so you
overshare problem.
so you think, do you, in your mind, it's mainly due to kind of the fact that Israel is more relatable? This is the main reason, you think, for the
I
typical
think I
European
think
people,
there
or you
are
think there are other
I
reasons?
think there are two reasons. I think there are two main reasons. Of course, there are many like complicated reasons or multi-layered reasons, but before I say the reasons, I want to say something before we go there. Um, in all of our conversation, I will assume the best intentions all the time. So I
Thank you.
think no, but I think that's how we can have a conversation. So I will try to say everything I want to say or I feel like saying, assuming the best intentions, and I will listen to everything you are saying, assuming the best intentions. So, like, yeah, like, I understand that you are an Israeli dancer, but no, like, here you are my partner in the podcast that I will assume all the good intentions of what you are saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Thank you for that. I think I said it also kind of to also include kind of the audience that are listening to us, and I just,
yes.
and maybe it's a little bit already, as an Israeli, I feel most of the time in some kind of a defensive posture when talking about Israel, even though within the Israeli discourse, I will be considered right now kind of a traitor. So it's a little bit a difficult position, because in Israel, I would be considered a radical leftist, but when I speak to European people, like I could be perceived as like a violent colonizer. So it's a bit
Yeah. Yeah, I
tricky
understand this,
position. But okay, yeah.
but I think yeah, we should yeah. So yeah, so that I think it is because of the relatability, like this idea that it is not relatable to them, and the other thing because the involvement of the government. So it is this idea that the degree of the governmental involvement with the Israeli situation is different from the degree of the governmental involvement with any other situations. Maybe like taking refugees with some representation, but sending arms or being very engaged in the conflict in a military financial standing point of view, that is very special to this conflict. So I think that's also what makes it very like present in the streets here.
Yeah. Okay, and one other question about that before we dive back to our past. And generally speaking, where you are and in your perception, did you experience kind of the discourse around you more pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, or like kind of more neutral, or what was your feeling around that? I'm just curious.
So as someone who is usually in the left scene, or that's most of my surrounding discourse, so I don't know if you have the clear idea about anti-state, anti-Deutsch kind of left separation in Germany and Austria. So it was this idea that there is always a fear of criticizing Israel because you will be considered anti-Semitic if you do this, so we don't want to go there. But also we have a different school that's anti-imperialistic, who is against all states in general, and against the occupation state in more in details. But most of the voices that I had around me was like this neutral voices of no, we are against the death of civilians on both sides, and we are condemning what Hamas did on 7th of October, but we also against the bombing of Israel to Gaza. Which I think is a very good stand if you don't have any pre-experience about the situation. It is a humanitarian action to take now, you know. So I think it's a positive, in my opinion, it's a positive take, more or less.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, no, I think it's I also, despite the fact that I think that being European is a much more, let's say, safe position, safe place, safe identity right now. I don't envy any European who is trying to put their head into this story, because no matter what they say, they will somehow be wrong, so it's not really easy, because it's either that you get, like, you kind of express some sentiment towards the Palestinian or towards the Israelis, or if you're trying to kind of understand both sides, so people will accuse you for not being, like not taking a clear decision. And if you don't say anything, people will accuse you of being silent. So to be honest, I think it's just a big mess. Let's go a little bit more to the past. I'm very curious to hear, like that if we can kind of dive into the stories of a bit of our childhood and how did we grow up, and for a moment, let's kind of leave a little bit this specific episode and this specific conflict, but just go back to our own histories and how did we learn to perceive one another across the borders. You growing up in Egypt, I grew up in Israel, so I'm very curious if you can start taking us into your life story.
Yes, so I'm so happy that somebody interested in my life story. That's really nice. But to start, it's always nice to talk about myself. But yeah, so I grew up in a Coptic Christian family in Egypt, in countryside, so in the Delta region. And for me, it was always a topic that's present. But as a child, I always perceive it as a religious topic. So I always perceive that, yeah, the Muslims are trying to fight for Al-Aqsa Mosque and for the holy space. And at certain point, as somebody growing in a Coptic Christian family, I was not very involved with this. I didn't relate or didn't have a resonance at me. But at the same time, there was a different side, which is a national side of no, but Egypt as a country had wars with Israel, and there was, as we were talking before, there was this idea of ancestors, uncles, like direct family members who were in the war, especially the 1973 war. So as a child, I didn't really relate to it because I was saying, okay, that's more of a Muslim thing. And then I started growing up a bit more, and I was into a more Nasri. Nasri is like the socialist version of Egypt, following Gamal Abdel Nasser kind of ideas of this kind of Arabic nationality thing, and that was part of my thinking at like, let's say, my middle school years. So it was this idea of perceiving, okay, that is some kind of a national struggle against an outside invader or occupier. And then at some point, I start having developed more of a non-religious identity, with a more of, let's say, an identity that's not so welcomed in a conservative country, relatively like Egypt. And then I had, okay, I don't feel so much belonging here. I feel a bit of alienizing here. While, for example, I start dancing and I start watching, like, let's say, Ohad Naharin and Kibbutz, and then, okay, there is a different, and of course, my all-time, like, I'm a fan of all-time of Tom Wixler, so it was this idea that on the other side, this advanced dance scene and active art scene and stuff like this. And then, okay, am I allowed to go to visit Israel as an Egyptian or not? And then there was a different way of perceiving Israel as a state that have a certain hierarchy and a certain relationship to Arabs even after the peace. And as I grow up more, let's say, understanding or involving in being a leftist person, especially with the Arab Spring and with our active political movement, I was part of it and I was trying to continue doing this. Then it was this idea of perceiving the Israeli-Palestinian situation from a different side as, okay, there is an oppressed and oppression, there is a different historical context, and there is a different way of perceiving it. And I felt that I went back to the point zero of having the same opinion of against Israel kind of political approach, but for a different reason. So I think that was my curve in going this on, okay, like now I perceive a different thing. But I think the good thing, or what I gained after this curve or this journey, is that I also perceive the Israeli part. So I also try to identify with that, okay, that's a state and that's people, and as I don't present my government, they don't present their government, and as I am born in this situation, some of them are born, like, let's say, for the third or fourth generation there, and some of them are, like, there since ever, so it is not a black and white, it is not an evil and good kind of pure situation, but it is a political struggle about how to take the oppressed kind of side. So that was somehow my understanding for it. Of course, I'm growing in time and understanding and in relation, and but that is in big lines, whatever.
Can you elaborate a little bit more? You said that at a certain point you started to feel a little bit alienated from your own culture, and you mentioned partially this kind of opening up for dance in general, and seeing that it's kind of like things that maybe caught your attention were available on the other side, so to speak, a side that you grew up with, kind of perceiving as some kind of I don't know if enemy or like the others. But were there other reasons that you started to feel a little bit alienated, or is it really, was it, I'm just curious, like if kind of you're growing up as a Christian
in of like yes, like in Egypt, I think all identities, as if you are not brown, hetero, cis, Muslim, Sunni man, you are kind of a minority in Egypt. And Egypt have a huge mainstream culture, dominant culture. And if you are more of a queer side or of an unreligious side, or even a leftist side now, you are a bit of a minority, and sometimes it's a bit dangerous. So I was threatened by this for many occasions from other, like, let's say, Islamic groups, for example. They threatened me by this in 3 or 4 occasions. I had some harsh conflicts in a physical way with some groups. So yeah, it was a bit of a situation
okay,
of how to
so a
live.
mixed between a mix between your own interest and how people perceive you from the outside, kind of.
No, and also like if you are queer in Egypt, that's dangerous. If you are atheist in Egypt, that's dangerous. If you are queer and atheist and leftist, that's much more dangerous.
Multi-danger.
So
okay.
That's multi-danger. So it's this idea that you have to hide your political interest because you can always get arrested by the police or the police state, and you have to hide your sexual interest because that's also maybe dangerous, and you have to hide your relationship because that is not subscribing to conservative atmosphere, and so there was always reasons to be threatened at some point.
And I have another question. You mentioned like you growing up, understanding it more as a kind of a religious conflict, and then like expanding the understanding into kind of also the national nature of the conflict and the geographical nature of it. But I'm curious, like more specifically, like to which like what was the image that you had on Jews and or Israelis when you grew up? Like I don't know, when you went to school, like have you been like how was the discourse around your childhood to kind of give you as a probably kind of impressionable young person an image of what is happening on the other side? Like what was the language you been exposed to, or maybe also kind of from your relative who had like this kind of direct experiences in the 73 war? Like, you know, like I'm really curious to understand like what is the...
So I think I understand your question. So I think, or I believe that is, I always had a very clear separation between Jews and Zionists, or between Jews and Israel. And the Jews' perception in Egypt is that this minority that is not there anymore. So there was a big part of Egypt that was a Jewish population, and during the 40s and 50s and the late 30s, they left Egypt for many reasons, and we had this kind of representation in old movies and in old plays and in literature of, okay, that was part of Egypt that's missing now. And we had many discussions about why it is missing and how we can like fix our problems that made this happen. And at the same time, of course, there is always the funny kind of fun pop culture in Egypt that make jokes about everyone who's different. So in the Egyptian pop culture, like, you know, the Christian person is very nerdy and always studying and, you know, going to be a physician or an engineer with like a very conservative, naive nature. And the Jewish person is usually a jeweler or like a money, you know, banker kind of thing. And they are always speaking in a funny accent and have, you know, a jewels shop. And Muslims are everything else. Yeah, but it was something. Yeah, but it was, but this stereotype, like, of course, it can show, let's say, a very deep discrimination against others. But by the time I was growing up, it was a funny old joke stereotype that's not funny anymore. So it was not that deep thing. It was, no, there was an acknowledgement of, yeah, these are stereotypes and actual people don't act like this. And at the same time, there is a big, there was also, like, I don't know if you have any information about the remaining Jews in Egypt. So there is a small community in Egypt which is the Jews who didn't leave. And some of them are actually pretty famous. And some of them were like the initiations of the communist movement in Egypt in the 60s. They were part of it. And there is Magda Haroun now. She is a super famous activist. and she is like, let's say, the elected head of the Jewish community in Egypt. And Magda Harun is a very
How big
very
is the Jewish
respectful-
community in
respect-
Egypt?
Nearly 100 people.
Okay, so very small. And is it are they living in
Yeah,
a
it's really
specific
small.
region?
I have no idea because if you are not a public figure, if they are not a public figure, they are normal citizens. I will say
Okay.
probably big cities. But it is not like that they are marked or allowed to be in certain places or something like this. No, that is not the case. But
Okay.
still, it's a very counted small community.
Okay, wow. I actually wasn't really
That-
aware.
That's about Jews. About Israel, it's a different thing.
Yeah, of course.
So about Israel, like first of all, I had my years of being a very, let's say, religious, like very very Christian religious. And then I was first introduced to the Zionist idea from a Christian point of view about, the coming back of Jesus and the Armageddon War and the millennial ruling and this, promised land, the rebuilding of the temple, Jesus is ruling for 1,000 years and stuff like this. That was part of the Christian discourse at this time. And also about, the national thing that we went to war against Israel in 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, and what happened, what's taking over of Sinai, and the attack of Bahr al-Bahr school in the Delta, which is so close to where I was born. And yeah, Abu Zaab factory and all of these stories and the literature of, there are many forces in Egypt, artists and many, let's say, sides that were against how the peace treaty in 1973, after the 1973 war was done. So there was also this big forces that, no, this shouldn't have ended like that. That treaty needed to be more, had different terms. I think everybody is somehow was with the peace treaty, but they were against how Sadat made the peace treaty. And then after this, there was a recent situation or the more contemporary situation that, yes, there are people in Palestine that are suffering from oppression and apartheid and a lot of stuff that's happening, and we are standing with them as form of standing with the oppressed. But also, you are going to Dahab or Sharm el-Sheikh and smoking a joint with Israeli people who are coming here for fun and going to the sea, and that's okay. So that was also part of how to deal with this idea of the governmental body that is very hated or somehow, but at the end we were all going to the Red Sea together. So that was also part of how it was. In my, let's say, high school, first college years.
It's interesting because you've mentioned now the Red Sea and Dahab. I think that's for me the first kind of association that I had. I grew up. When I grew up and I kind of started to be exposed to the typical, let's say, perspective or the mainstream perspective about the region and the history, so for sure, I grew up understanding that we, the Israelis, were always victim of Arabic aggression. Nobody ever talked about Israeli aggression. So there was always this kind of victimhood narrative that I think that is very much embedded in the Jewish identity, regardless the history of the state of Israel, but kind of, let's say from the Exodus, from ancient, the kingdom of the pharaohs up to like the pogroms in the Eastern Europe. Like there's always this identity of like we are being persecuted, and this was expanded also to the perspective of even the six. I don't know, like for example, even the 6 Days War, which actually started with a bombing of the Israeli Air Force on the airplane of the Egyptian and Syrian army on the ground. In the Israeli perspective, I've learned that this was a preemptive attack because of the aggression that was expected to appear from the Egyptian and Syrian side. And I don't know if you have a different way of that you've learned it. So, but then like my first real experience, like meeting Egyptian and meeting people who are actually there, was in Sinai, which is kind of a weird bubble in the middle of between Israel and Egypt. And there I met, of course, many Bedouins that I don't know actually what's their relation to this Egyptian entity, because I did feel that I did hear many Bedouin kind of express a certain resentment towards the government and a certain kind of skepticism, and like we just want to live the way we want to live here in our region. But I also met many Egyptian people, more in Nueba and Dab and places like this, and there was a certain feeling of okay, in this region, like nobody, like we can just be people next to one another. But still, every time I had to cross the border, there was this meeting with this, people who represent the Egyptian system, like soldiers, police officers that are standing in the border. And I also grew up hearing like stories that like, okay, no matter what, you have to be really careful not to be caught with any weed when you come back on the border, because you can be thrown to jail, and like then like you can forget about your rights and everything. And like so there was always like a certain let's say subtle fear, like around it. And yeah, it's I feel like it's something like, when I'm speaking to you, and I also have another colleague who is Egyptian, and I kind of meet people in person that we have shared interests, I feel like I'm starting to dissolve all these structures that have been built to me, even though that cognitively I think it's very easy to understand that we are all humans, blah, 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 and have this, let's say, kind of universal humanitarian perspective. But in reality, my nervous system was always triggered with fear. And that's something I'm working on to kind of, break through that.
Like,
And
I would say that the Egyptian perception of Israel is very complicated because it have two nearly opposite narratives that the government is producing. So, for example, officially, on the governmental level and on army level, there is no conflict at all. So, as far as I know, officially, after the peace treaty, they are so close partners, economically and military and everything. But because Egypt is ruled by military since like 1950s, the military will always thrive by having an enemy close by. So there should be a certain explanation why most of the Egyptian budget is going to military. And it was very easy to have this explained by we have an enemy on the borders. And through the ties between the Egyptian people and the Palestinian people, it is very easy narratives to fix. So it was this idea that these are our enemies, I am not allowed to cross the borders, and if I have an Israeli stamp in my passport, I'm not allowed to come back to Egypt. But we share economy, we share gas, we share agriculture, we share military, and we share everything with them. So as a governmental...
And this is, you talk after the peace treaty, you're still...
After the peace treaty, yes.
Okay, so what is this thing about, like the thing with with Egyptian not being allowed to go to Israel? Is this an official thing? Because I heard different things, and I'm curious to understand. Like
I can't do it.
and it's like it's in the law that you will be, or it's like just some kind of an unofficial policy
it's
that
not
they
in the
will
law,
do
but
problems
like
for you.
no, it's not like written like this. But for example, to if I'm asking for a visa or if I'm trying to apply to travel to Israel, that is probably a death sentence. I will go to the police state security being investigated so much, and that's a very dangerous. I will get rejected usually. So usually people like even if I'm going to Ramallah or if I go to a Palestinian land, because the whole thing is governed by Israel border wise.
Okay.
So usually people go to Jordan, and from Jordan they go there. And there
Okay.
is
And
always
could you
the story that they will stamp your passport in an external paper so you can go back to Egypt without being investigated. So that was also the
and
idea that
can you explain me
if
why is that like the case? Like, because as you said, like the government on one hand officially collaborates with Israel economically, and there's also like some kind of military discussions, and but why do the government have an interest to prevent the people from meeting the Israeli people? Or I know it's a big question
no,
that
it's not
I'm sure
meeting
like
the Israeli people because we meet in Sinai.
no, I mean
But
really cross to
but
the other side, like
yeah, I think it's like I have no answer for this. I don't know what they think of, but I will always think that they need to have an enemy, and there is always this idea that we need to justify um, a certain reason for arming the Egyptian army so much. There is also the other thing about information. Like, for example, I have the same story that you just mentioned now about the 6 Days War, but I have a very different story, for example, about 1973. In the Egyptian history books, we won the war. We had like a massive win. It is like the pride of the Egyptian army. And most of like the other sides, history think no, that is not the case. It's not that massive victory as the Egyptian army is promoting. So I think there is also the idea of the information kind of movement. And also the very simple thing, the Egyptian government doesn't want to take accountability. If I kill somebody there or blow myself there or do any kind of vandalism act
okay,
in Israel, so yeah,
I
we
understand.
don't
Okay,
want to have
wow,
this.
that's actually a new perspective I've never thought about, because I always looked at it kind of from the perspective that as a state, maybe there is some um, anti-Semitic sentiments or anti-Zionist sentiments, and that the government is like, okay, we have peace right now, but we don't want the people actually to really desire peace. We want to preserve this tension. But I never thought about the situation that there could be the case that somebody who is Egyptian and let's say maybe has a more radical interpretation of Islam, maybe a jihadist even, goes and does something, a terror attack, something in Israel, and then Egypt needs to kind of explain that or like take responsibility of that. And do you think that there are groups in Egypt that do you think that have this still such radical positions that would be willing to risk their life to for the sake of
Like I
martyrdom, and like
think it is no, I think it's a definite thing that yeah, like Egyptians, like I think that's a very like dominant kind of feeling that we want to fight or to stand for Palestinians, and we want to stand for Palestinians in an economic way and in supporting humanitarian aid way, and some people want to stand for Palestinians in a military way also. And I think that was clear in a way. Okay, so there is something I want to be able to explain. I think it will need some time to explain, but I think there is a very kind of difference in perceiving how people perceive the conflicts. So if we talk about Egypt, for example, Egypt is a dictatorship that is really controlling the media flow. And this somehow makes people have a very simple, primitive stance. So yeah, these are Israelis, these are evil, you know, I will just go with my small Kalashnikov and fight for Palestine and, you know, perish there because that is the stand. So the idea of having a more of a political pressure or standing for a more sustained peace or standing for this idea of oppressed rights and have a clear, let's say, moral or ethical stand without being, you know, running over and hit people with a stick, that is really not welcome discourse there, you know. So it's this idea of there is always an emotional eruption more than no, we are a state, we can act like a state, we can meet, we can have a certain kind of a political stand towards something. Because there is no connection between the government and the people, and there is no information kind of circulation in a free way. So that's why, for example, you always see eruptions. You always see that a random security guard saw, like, you know, a car of like a bus of a tourist group from Israel, and he just shot like random bullets and killed two of them, and he thinks that he did something good. Why is this? Because he is so angry, he doesn't know what he's doing, he can't represent himself to the government doesn't hear to what he have to say about any kind of political conflict or military conflict, so he just, okay, let's do something. In a very, I will say, wrong way or like condemned way or something, or savage way. But that is also this idea that, yeah, this detachment from how we are as people from our political entity make all the actions come like this.
I see.
I'm not justifying it, I'm just explaining it.
Yeah, sure. No, I didn't think that you're justifying it. So in a way, you think that it's more rooted in a certain, let's say, anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist sentiment rather than really purely hatred towards Jews, no? But I wonder, like, so you said that you grew up clearly with this differentiation between Jews and and Israelis and Zionists. So what was your perception about this? Because I know that, you know, like, this is something that, for example, when I was in SEED many years ago, I had a teacher, she was in Switzerland, and when she talked to me, it was the first time that she heard, and she was a person in her 30s, that the Judaism is both, could be understood as a religious practice, but also as a certain, let's say, ethnical identity that kind of carries the legacy of the Bronze Age, when religion and tribal identity were not separated yet. And I wonder, like, what was explained to you, or how did you kind of understood this? That, because you said you had a clear separation. So what did you learn about that, or like?
So I still don't understand this till now, and I still have problems in linking this, because for me, there are people, and these people have a political identity, which they means that they follow a certain state based on a geographical and political bodies. So I am an Egyptian person because I was born in this geographical region following this government, and I can accept, hate, go against whatever my stand towards this political entity. And multi-layered, I have my own identity, which my spiritual belief, my political belief, all kind of identities that I will relate with. And for me, that is how we applied it on Israel. There is like this state body that we can have different opinions on. We can call it settler, colonial, we can call it whatever we can want to call it, agree on it or disagree on it. And there are people who are living there. And these people mostly have a religious identity of being Jews. But there are also Jews who don't share the same political identity. So there is also Jews everywhere in Egypt and outside Egypt who are not Israeli Jews. And the same thing as Zionism, we perceived it as an ideology that had Jewish people and Christian people believing in it. And there are Jewish people and Christian people who are not Zionist. So it was this idea of perceiving a political identity and an ideology, and also perceiving that's a religion. And there was this idea of in Egypt, as a country that's majority of it is Muslim, facing all kind of problems of how the majority perceives the minorities, that we are trying to be treated equally in front of the law. So we are trying to separate our political identity as Egyptian citizens who have rights and duties from our religious identity. And by the same logic, we understood others. So we were trying to apply the same logic on atheist, non-religious Jews, even Muslims from different, like Sunni or Shia or whatever. And this idea of you are a citizen and you are a religious person or a non-religious person. And that is how I perceived it there. And I am still facing a certain difficulty in understanding what does it mean to be a Jew person or a Jewish person. Because I was, like, the way I understood what happened during the Nazi aggression towards Jews, for example, was that the idea that away from the physical extermination, there was the dehumanization and denationalization. So these people were captured from their countries, and their names and nationalities were taken off and giving numbers, and be dehumanized and be exterminated in a very, like, brutal way. But part of it was that they are no one, so it is taking their identity away. And for me, I was thinking that, okay, so there is a certain reclaiming for this identity. You need to have your name back, nationality back, assets back, rights back. But I think how it is perceived now, or how it is fluid right now, this idea of tribal, as you were mentioning, religious things, that a Jew person is not a religious background, it's an ethnic background. I don't know how I feel towards this or how I understand this. So that's also one of my personal struggles.
Cool. Maybe I can share a bit my perspective, and then I also want to share the perspective of how I grew up understanding kind of the Arab identity, and it would be nice kind of to get your mirror and reflection about it from your understanding. If you enjoyed the conversation so far and found it meaningful, please consider to share the episode with others and to click the like button. These small actions might seem meaningless, but they are the fuel that helps the podcast project to move forward. Your attention and time is highly valued, and we would love to hear more about the insights you might have from listening to this episode. And please consider to subscribe to the channel to be notified for all future uploads. So regarding Judaism, I think that again, it's what makes it, to my estimation, complicated is again that the legacy of this tradition and religion goes really back to the Bronze Age. So we are talking about like like the kingdom of David and Solomon goes back kind of to 1000 BC. And as far as I'm aware, and again, like take me with a grain of salt because I'm not an historian, but as far as I understand, in this historical period, there was still not the separation between your identification on the level of ethnicity and your religious identification. It was just one thing, and that kind of relates to the fact that this separation happened much later. We can maybe point out to the Enlightenment in Europe, that people started to separate and say, okay, the state is not the church, and there are two different things, and I can have this identity and that identity. And that was something that was much more unified. So people who were practicing this religion that worshipped the one God, the nameless God, which also kind of gave birth later to Christianity and Islam, they were the Hebrews. And the Hebrews practiced that religion that later kind of got the name Judaism. And so there was no separation. And then, of course, this kingdom was destroyed several times, and eventually the Roman kind of just threw most of them away, and the 12 tribes, the 12 ancient Hebrew tribe, have been scattered and around the world. Now, to some extent, these people have managed to preserve something from their tradition, which I think could be mostly categorized nowadays under the umbrella of religion. So some people kind of ended up in Europe, some people ended up in Ethiopia, some people ended up in India, some people ended up in many, many places around the world. And I can assume that, because life is never like life operates always on multi-variables simultaneously. So I can assume that, as minority groups, some tried to kind of fit into their society, some tried to kind of more preserve their traditions. There's always this tension between conservative thinking and progressive thinking. So people did different things. And then you ended up in a situation that in the early beginnings of the Zionist movement, there was still very clear feeling that the Jews are minorities and that there is persecution to them based on their identity. But if you would really take a Jewish person from Berlin in 1920 and you will compare him to a Jewish person in Yemen, it will be hard for you to say, yeah, look, they are the same tribe, because they have been for many, many years been embedded in a completely different culture with completely different norms, with completely different, political, technological, cultural perspectives. But at the same time, they maintain certain things that could unite them. One thing that Jewish people kind of kept maintaining throughout the history is a certain level of Jewish solidarity. So, for example, there are cases that you see that Jewish people in Morocco and Algeria would organize donation of money because of the news that some Jewish people experienced pogroms in Eastern Europe. So there is this kind of, and if you compare it to Christianity at that time, it will be hard to expect that a French Christian will have solidarity towards a French German, because they saw themselves as completely different nations, and national identity was much stronger than the religious identity. And I think that's what makes Judaism more complicated. And then, on top of it, you have this kind of Zionist identity, which is mainly a political identity, as you've mentioned, as far as I understand Zionism, but that was not elected, so to speak, but did try to represent Jews. So it was funded by Jews in order to represent Jews, but it was not really an elected body because there was no one to elect it. There was no state to kind of decide what will be our political approach. So there was just different groups, different individuals, different people who initiated things. And when you look deeply into Zionism, you see that there were many different forms of Zionism, and the one which became the dominant was what kind of you could see as kind of a mixture between Zionism and socialism. That was the most dominant force that kind of eventually made the decisions on the ground and became later the first government, the first elected government in Israel, which were, again, a kind of a more left socialist Zionist coalition. So I think that that's one of the reasons why it's so complicated. But to some extent, if you think about the history, and you also mentioned kind of the Holocaust, I think that in those years after the Second World War, it was very difficult not to look at Zionism as political representation for Jews, at least in Europe and in the United States. Again, because they were trying to find a solution to stop persecution against Jews in Europe. At the same time, they had there was a very complicated relationship between the Zionist and Jews who were born in, the Arabic Gulf and Africa, Northern Africa. So it's as you said, it's a very intricate thing. It's very difficult to kind of make clear boundaries. But I would say that nowadays, if I think about 2023, so you can be an Israeli, and an Israeli means you can be an Arab. You can be a Jew. Sorry, you can be of Arabic ethnicity. You can be Druze. You can be Bedouin, and there's a few more minority groups from an ethnical perspective. You can have a religious practice. You can be an Orthodox. You can be whatever. You can be the different expression of other religion, Protestant, Christian. Yeah, whatever. But at the same time, being an Israeli, there is an unofficial hierarchy that if you're a Jew, it's kind of taken for granted that you are loyal and you have the best interest for your country. And if you're an Arab Israeli, you have to prove that. You're not born with the same automatic alignment, but you have to prove that because, I think that many Israeli Arabs still perceive themselves as Palestinians with Israeli passport. So I think it's a complicated thing. And so I hope I kind of a little bit made some clarification. It's okay if I kind of go into telling you a little bit how I grew up understanding this relation between
please
Arabs and Egypt, and so yeah, I think that I grew up knowing that there are different Arabic states, like Egypt, like Jordan, like Syria, like Lebanon, like Iraq, whatever. But I had very limited experience being in those places. But I grew up in very close vicinity to Israeli Arabs and also to some extent to Palestinian Arabs. And for me, I think that that's something that was very clear in the way I've been educated in Israel, is that we didn't perceive the difference between the different nationalities as the primary way of understanding the people around. So I would say that this idea of pan-Arabic identity was much more dominating the understanding. And you can say that it also serves a certain political agenda, because if all the Arabs are the same, so to speak, and we grew up with this political with this historical narrative that there were many Arabic tribes in the region, and eventually, after the First World War, Britain didn't follow its promise to to the Emir Faisal to build him a big kingdom of Arabs, but instead France conquered it, and eventually they started to draw maps and create this Jordanian kingdom, which the Emir Abdallah became the head, and then later Syria and Lebanon, and also Egypt that was also colonized by the British, and then they created this Palestine region. So we grew up with the understanding that, okay, this was a European creation that had nothing to do with the people on the ground, and that all this national identity, okay, they kind of later became more and more real, but historically speaking, they have no meaning at all. And I'm curious if that's the case. Like, what is your understanding? And I don't know if you can also think of it a little bit like kind of on your grandparents and like, what is the relation and how do you see yourself, and what would you say that is common between you and a Palestinian and a Jordanian and a Syrian, and what is very different between you, which I'm sure that, you know, the perspective that I presented to you is kind of maybe how I grew up. It's not something that I necessarily stand for right now, but I'm really curious to hear you.
So that is the first time I hear this story, actually. And I would say that most Arabs, if they hear about it, they will think that's super offensive. Because, like, yeah, there were many times for many reasons where the borders were fluid, where states were bigger or smaller or stuff like this. But there was always these groups, and they are not the same. Like, I have nothing common between me and a Libyan person or Palestinian person. Maybe the color of the skin. Maybe we can understand each other in a way, but if they spoke to each other in a dialect, I don't even understand them. So yeah, like, I think there was this Western idea of all of these are Arabs, but for the Arabic people, it was never the same. So if I give some examples, for example, about the Egyptian history, so there was always this body that's called Egypt, which is the place surrounded by the Nile towards the south. And for many ages, or for many years, or for many countries, like, there was a more stronger dominant state that could invade the other regions, which will take some part of Libya, which will take Sudan and go south towards Ethiopia. They will take Jordan, Palestine, and the whole Levantine area. Or it was much weaker, for example, and then it will only be around the Nile line towards the south. But even when this was the case, there was a different separation. So, for example, until the 50s, Egypt and Sudan was one country. But still, these people were Sudanese. So they were called Sudanese. They had different tradition, different food, different music, different accent, different ways of living, and different culture from A to Z. But it is ruled by Egypt. So they will pay taxes, get hirement, follow the Egyptian political and religious bodies. The Ethiopian church follows the Egyptian church, and stuff like this. But that was always the case. Now, for example, there is Nubia, which was a middle kingdom between Egypt and Sudan. And after the British colonization made this line of separation between Egypt and Sudan, there is no country now called Nubia. But that doesn't change the fact that in south of Egypt, there are people who have different language, with 3 accents, with different tradition, with different clothes and culture and food and universe. It's a different country. The same thing as Libya, for example. If people in Libya speak in their dialect, I don't understand them. They have different culture for food, for history, for everything. The same thing with Algeria, with Morocco, with Tunisia. I don't know what they...
Can I insert one question?
It is very good. Yes, of course.
Yeah, sorry. By the way, I don't know if you know, my mother was born in Morocco, so I have some roots for coming from this region. My question is this: like, for sure, it is very clear for me that like national borders are to some extent artificial, because if you are visiting people on the ground, you see that it's a little bit more like a gradient rather than like a sharp cut. So I don't know, if I travel from Austria to Italy and I start to go to the area of Tyrol, and then I go to South Tyrol, then I start seeing people who are speaking a little bit Italian. They also speak German with a funny accent, and they, I don't know, they, you know, like alongside the Apfelstrudel, they also have some kind of a baked pizza, whatever, you know, I'm just making stereotypes. But like you see that the culture is, the culture is like a gradient. Like people are not like, okay, from here and there, unless it has been very artificially created, no? And that's what I was trying to understand. And maybe the way I phrased myself was that you say, oh, this will be very offensive for an Arab person today, because maybe it's kind of very Eurocentric perspective on the region. But I'm trying to understand, like, to which degree there are similarities, cultural similarities, because, you know, like when you say, okay, if somebody doesn't speak the dialect, but sorry, I just want to finish my point, and then I'm very happy to give you all the space to answer. Like, because also in Austria, for example, you know, like if you go to Tyrol and they speak their heavy dialect, so people in Vienna will not understand, and they can be very cynical about one another, but still, you know, they are part of this Germanic identity, and they are sharing national identity, and that's something that I wonder to which degree it's true or false. Is there really something like an Arabic identity, or is it really just for you something that is really being placed from the outside?
Very minimal, and that's what I wanted to say, is that away from the idea of the borders, away from how strong the states were at some point, there are still differences. So for example, until 1840, for example, the whole area belonged to Egypt, including Saudi Arabia, Al-Hijaz, including Jordan, and including all the Levantine area until, let's say, the borders of Iraq. This was a sub-colony, like Egypt had this Muhammad Ali kind of state, which was still reports to the Ottoman Empire, but it has more of an autonomous strength and kind of ruling. And that, so as a political border, that was all the same place. But if you look culturally inside, no, that is different. You know that in this area you are in Jordan. You know that different food, different places, different dialect, different way of clothing, different dishes, different music, different everything. While, for example, in Sudan, it will be much different. While in this area, it was one state in a way. So I think the diversity between the Arab countries is much more different than it is perceived. Also, there is something that we usually don't talk about as Arab countries, which is the Arabic colonialism. Like what happened when Islam took some kind of a military quest to preach religion and went through all of this area. So what kind of languages and culture that was taken from this and what remains? So for example, Egypt, people think that Egypt is an Arabic speaking country, which is correct. But Egypt has 3 other languages inside. So Nubian is not Arabic, it's a different language. The Bedouins in Siwa have a different language, which is Amazigh, the indigenous language of North Africa, of North African tribes. So it is this idea that the cultural identity in these regions, I would say it's so diverse, so specific, and so old than the actual borders in a way. And this creates some ties that okay, I have some ties with Syrians, for example, because of language, culture, and some things that we can relate to. but I have so different attitude and culture and way of living than them. For example, even eating is so different. Music is so different. So that is this
Super
idea
interesting.
that there is an identity out older than the borders.
So you would say, because like again, another thing that I'm curious. So you would say like that this whole idea of the Arab League that have been created, kind of in the beginning of the 40s, if I'm not mistaken. So you would say that this is merely like a political identity that has nothing to do with like that is really artificial, if I understand you correctly, because if there are such different cultural gaps between, let's say, the Arab-speaking people in Egypt and the Arab-speaking people in Syria, so it seems as if it's more of a political organization rather than really something that would come from solidarity. But on the other hand, you did express that there is certain solidarity towards Palestinian in the Egyptian population. So where does this solidarity come from? If that's like, it's, I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to question, or
I
like
understand what you mean, and I
figure
understand
out.
that at certain level, my words can seem contradictory. But let's say,
No,
for
I don't
example, in the
experience it as
40s,
contradictory. I don't experience
yeah.
it as contradictory. I think that again, like we can have multiple opposing identities that will generate different types of solidarities inside of us, and I'm just trying to understand it again because I'm so ignorant to that. So yeah, if you could kind of dive deeper to it, like let's start with this Arabic League. What is this?
Okay.
Like, why? What do you think that?
Yeah, I will say also my perception about it. I'm also not a historian,
Yeah.
so I will also say like how I perceived it. So let's say there is someone called Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, he is an Albanian warlord, more or less, and he was sent to Egypt in the end of the 1700s to fight the French quest that came to Egypt by Napoleon Bonaparte. So the Ottoman Empire sent this guy. He's an Albanian warlord with some like troops to fight the French. He stayed there and he started what we perceive as a modern Egyptian state. That he and his dynasty made the first kingdom, or the modern kingdom of Egypt, where it started from 1805 until 1952. That was him and his dynasty ruling Egypt. And in this area, there was a body called Kingdom of Egypt, ruled by these people, him and his sons and brothers, and they had like a full-grown, mature political and military state. But at the same time, they are not fully independent from the Ottoman Empire. And then at certain point, there is the British Empire coming and takes a place in the first, let's say, in the First World War One. There is something called the Protection Declaration, where the UK or the British Empire invaded Egypt first military in 1886, and then start having a political protection starting from the 1910 or 1914s and on. So in this, let's say, conflict, you have a kingdom that is trying to preserve itself and have a certain kind of autonomy, and there is a certain following also that is to the colonizing body. And then when it came to the 40s and to the 1917, the Balfour Declaration, so there was this idea that, actually, after the British is gone, we are not going to have what we had. There is something different that will be there. And I think that is the start point of the rejection of this region towards the idea of the new Arthur Balfour Declaration of 1917. And I believe that is the start of the Palestinian strike against the British colony, all of the small wars and conflicts between the Palestinian people and the Jewish villages and settlements that came before 1947. I think that is somehow how we can read this situation. And then in 1948, there was this idea that, okay, the British said hands off, and now you deal with what is there. And then there was this idea of trying to maintain or reclaim or preserve the state or the kingdom or the idea that was initiating away of the Ottoman and British thing of having the 1840 kingdom. So let's say, for example, if the history went differently and if the Arab armies won against Israel and they had the whole area, I imagine that that was going to be mainly ruled by Egypt. More or less.
Okay. So you think that yeah.
Maybe I'm
Yeah, I also think that, as far as I'm aware, that in 48, when the different Arabic countries invade Israel, like what was just the new state of Israel, as far as I know, they did it more from their own expansionist interest rather than for liberating the Palestinian people and establishing a Palestinian state. But this is something that this is
I
something
think
that
it was
I'm really curious.
mixed.
Yeah,
I think it was both. I think everybody had
was
their
both.
own, reason to do it. So I think, yeah, of course, like it's a war. I don't believe in a fully ethical war ever. So I believe that, yeah, there was many who had their reasons to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I take the reference to kind of come with this statement from the fact that there was the Palestinian military leader Abed Kader El Husseini, who was kind of one of the most prominent military and leaders for the Palestinian armed forces that operated around Jerusalem, and he went to Damascus to plead in front of the Arab League for support, and they rejected him. And that was just after this resolution 181, when the UN declared that there would be the split of the land, and he didn't get the solidarity that he expected. But then when the Palestinian armed forces were completely broken already, then the Jordanian army and the Syrian army and the Egyptian army went into the war, and that's kind of how I come with this understanding. But would and now I have a question. Like maybe you think that it's I don't know, what would you think about this question, but would you say then that the solidarity with Palestinian is more rooted with this anti-Zionist sentiment rather than really true authentic connection to the Palestinian as people, or would you say it's both?
I say it's both, and also I will say it's both. I will say it's also the bad blood between the Egyptians and the Israeli Zionist movement in our wars together. I think it's also the idea of a religious kind of force. So this idea of Islamic world, Islamic unity, your Muslim brothers in China is suffering, we need to stand with them. So I think that's the idea of also there is a religious part of it. And I think it's also in the 50s, Abdel Nasser was very, like, I think he had many flaws and I hate him, and I think he was like really part of this socialist, not so socialist kind of wave of Ceausescu and Tito and Mao. So yeah, I think he was the Egyptian version of these people. But he was so sincere about the idea of the third world liberation of European or colonial occupation of imperialistic old forces. And I think there is a deep belief that the state of Israel is the extension of this
Okay. Yeah.
colonial force.
Yeah. I think this
So I
is
think it
really
is a mixture of all of them.
yeah. The point you brought up, I think it's really the core debate that from there you can either slide to a more pro-Israeli perspective or to a more pro-Palestinian perspective. And if you're more exploring it from a, let's say, kind of if you're more a truth seeker, if there's something like that, I think you will just come to the understanding that it's both. That the state of Israel, like that the Zionist movement could be perceived to some extent as a political body that was supported by imperial forces, but you can also see it as a political body that was revolting against colonial forces. So I think it's a very, very complicated question. I think it's also kind of what I come up with, like you describing me, this kind of, again, gradient of identities and cultures and subcultures, is this kind of notion that it's very difficult to define which group of people are a nation. So in a way, it's a very tricky thing to begin with, because like what would we define as a nation? And I think that like there is an anecdotal perspective that we can refer, I think, to the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and that's like after the UN declaration, the reaction of one of the Israeli Zionist leader called Zalman Shazar, he said that people, kind of, or like nation, who aspire to life must choose independence and make territorial compromises, while Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was the main the head leader of the Palestinian political movement, national movement, said that like a nation or people who aspire to life cannot accept the division of their land. And I think that these two different understandings is also kind of in a way related to what we are talking about, because like what makes people to be perceived as a nation? Is it their religion, religious affiliation? Is it their culture? Is it their custom? Is it just their authentic connection to the geography of where they are born? And I think that it's like, you know, there is something quite maybe simplistic about trying to cut clearly and say, you know, this is the main thing that makes people feel like they are people, that they are like a nation. And I think that it's always like this mixture of many things. As you said, like, okay, it's partially a certain Muslim religious connection. It's partially something with the language. It's partially something with the region. It's there's so many things, and there is something very artificial yet real with national identity. And you know, I don't know. I mean, it brings me a lot of thoughts that go more to dance, and maybe it's also good maybe to kind of slightly short, like maybe soon slide a little bit more to talk about our profession. You know, nowadays I'm very busy with this whole topic of unification and multiplication. So like when you're dancing in a group of people, let's say you're jamming. So to which degree you can experience unification with the group until a point that you can kind of dissolve your on the level of experience, you can dissolve your independence, and you just feel yourself, okay, I'm part of this bigger brain of movement. Maybe that's kind of a maybe more poetic way of saying it. I'm kind of part of this ocean of movement. Or to which degree I'm multiplying the space, and then I really experience myself as an autonomous entity that has distinct boundaries between me and the people around me. And I think this game that it's very clear to experience it in the studio. I think it's like, you know, you press play in the real world, and you go from like this Western liberal perspective of individualism all the way to humanism, and you pass through all the different tribal identities and religious identities and national identities, and it's a very, very complicated thing. And I'm asking myself, and I don't know if you have some intuition, like how to allow our identities to be alive and not to reject them, but not make them the fuel for hatred, violence, and
Like, I think the question about identity stands independent from us. So I would say that in a utopia, in a dream world, in my dream world, I am perceived as Shady, as a person, without even my name. I am perceived as me, and I have the space to exist and express. But the fact is that I don't. The fact is this: as soon as you look at me, you see a certain skin color. As soon as I speak, I have a certain accent. I was born in a certain place, and this gives me a certain set of rights. I have a certain passport. I am nothing without this passport, and this passport defines how I am treated or perceived everywhere in the world. And I have a certain body, I have a certain shape, I have a certain sexuality, I have a certain beliefs, and as far as sometimes I wish, I can't shake these things off. I will always be an exotic token when we speak about the European context. I will always get invitations because we need somebody who looks different. After I get kicked out of Seed, there was the discussions with the beautiful monarch that rules Seed about what happened with me, and she said that we never had someone Arabic or African, so we wanted to have him to get a new perspective, and then it didn't work, so he had to leave. So there was nothing about my art in this conversation. I was more of a token to show inclusivity. And this happens most of the time. You always look to calls, and we need a person of color. We need like a queer artist. We need whatever. So I think there is always this idea that how much of our identity is by choice, and how much of our identity is forced upon us. And when we dissolve in this one brain of movement, when we are part of a unison, or when we are part of a group dance expression or movement, how much are we actually of this part of this group, and how much we can't shake? And that is always the question of like I'm on a podcast now with Matan, my friend that I met in the Tibra in 2018, or I am an Egyptian dancer talking to an Israeli dancer, and we are discussing the situation. However we decide to have it, everybody who will see the video will perceive it in a different way. So I think the question about art and identity is so complicated because it's not in our hands. It's forced on us at some degree.
First, I agree with you, and maybe in that context that I try to kind of elicit to you about the jam, we are already kind of making a certain idealistic bubble. There is a space in which we allow ourselves to be whatever we are, and we are trying to be as less judgmental as we can to one another. So that's already like, of course, it's not the real world. No. Of course. But again, my perception is anchored with this kind of hypothesis that we have this potential on the level of consciousness to experience unification with the world. And therefore, if this potential exists, it means that those identities that are real could be transcended. And I know, as you say, I totally agree with you, it's not in your hand how the world will perceive you. But what I'm questioning is to which degree we should act as individuals to promote that, and to which degree, and what would be a path towards it. Because I think, like one path would be, the path of activism. And as far as I'm concerned, I feel like that it creates a lot of the cementation of identities. As you said, like, okay, we want to be inclusive, so we need some Arab artist. Shady, please come to our school. And then, on the other hand, you can take this approach of, okay, like, what could be described in this kind of umbrella, like, this kind of color blindness that we say, okay, look, we don't care about anything about your identity. If you're a good dancer, you're welcome to our school. But then, there's not going to be many, maybe Egyptian dancer, because they don't come from the same background and technical training. So then, like, maybe so maybe we will never have you. And maybe dance is a little bit hard also because it's because in art I think we can allow ourselves to play with this how you call it, tokenizing, maybe other people will call it inclusivity. We can play with it because we are doing something very subjective. But like I haven't seen a football team that just tries to have an inclusive members of the team, but they just look who is the best football player that we can get, because there is a competitive aspect, and then it's kind of, if you dismantle competence, you will lose. So, but in dance, at the end of the day, I'm not a better dancer than you, or you're a better dancer than me. We have different styles, we have different approaches. It's very hard to judge it. So I can understand this switch of saying, hey, let's give other people who come from different background perspectives, but it's very tricky to do it in a way that is real and that is not offending.
But that is what we try for, right? That's why we are artists and activists. That's why we work for it. I think we can understand how the world works and perceive how the real world, if there is something like this, operates, but still we can aim for a different thing. I can aim for, as you are saying, I can aim for certain transcendence, that my identity doesn't interrupt my unity. I can aim for this idea that I can be unique and inclusive and accepted and different. So I think it's also this question, because if we go back to the first part of our meeting, I think there is a certain kind of solidarity comes from the wish to be part of a bigger group. You want to be a part of a bigger nation, a stronger body, a bigger march in a certain way, and that's why we want to walk in certain direction. And I think maybe there is a way, as art, as it is not competitive, as there is no marks and points and goals, that we can aim for a world where you can be inclusive, diverse, not offending anyone, real, authentic, and also carry the heritage that you have with you as a body memory, as a cultural memory, as an emotional heritage to the unity. So I think it's also this idea. I would like at some point that I am able to dance with you and feel and have empathy to the stories that you tell me that I have never experienced. I would like one day that when I am walking in a never again kind of march, that I can have a certain emotional empathy that I will show it as I felt it. So I think that is also the magic of unity of the jam thing, that we are dancing together. But yeah, we need to work for it. We need to aim for it. Maybe it's a bit poetic, idealistic, but that is what I want to do in my life, for example.
Yeah, I know, I agree with you. I think, like, it's not that everybody who goes to a jam, to, like, every group of people who jam together necessarily gonna end up in a more peaceful, harmonious, transcendent state. I just think it has this potential. And I agree with you that it's also, I mean, what you shared now resonates with me. And in my words, I would say, like, yeah, it's a very necessary thing to really make a space to feel the pains of other people. And I have a friend who has been working a lot with psychedelics, and he told me that, like, every time that he comes back from a weekend where he's been taking a psychedelic medicine, it takes him a very long time just not to feel the pain of all the people around him. And that on one hand, it's like very, like, he feels extremely connected all the time because, like, the boundaries between him and other people are kind of dissolving. But at the same time, it's extremely difficult to operate because you're constantly confronting that there's so much suffering, there's so much grief, there's so much pain around, that for him was a very difficult thing to find the agency how to act when you are confronted with it. And I think that that's many, and I can assume that that's one of the many reasons why we shut ourselves down, why we, like, why we can say, okay, like, I have these people who kind of recognize now that there is something bad in my country, and there's like, oh, how are you? Oh, is it still hard? Oh, yeah. Oh, a shame. Like, they cannot open up to feel my pain because maybe they have so much pain of their own, and it's a very, yeah, it's a very difficult thing to really do, to expand internally. And I wouldn't say that dancers necessarily have an advantage in that. I've seen also, like, a lot of pathological thing happening in the dance world. I think it's a very individualistic thing, but I feel like that, like, I didn't feel any challenge kind of inviting you and having you in this space because we already had a personal connection. I think that it's just that this political context might pull us to see each other as enemies, but on an individual level, I feel like I have a lot of space to talk to so many people, but then, like, the moment this kind of political umbrella is coming down, and I think that politics at the end of the day is a binary thing. You have to choose. You have to say, like, do I go to the left, do I go to the right? Am I pro, am I against? You cannot be, I'm everything. And that's very polarizing. And that's why I'm not really engaged in political activism, I would say. Like, I think it's not my tool, because I don't see politics as a tool to unify perspective. But I don't know, maybe you have a different experience about that, and different relation to dance than me, for sure.
Like, I would say that I tried my whole life to act in this binary situation, to have, okay, I have a stand, I have a decision, I can say I am pro something and against something. And I think it was a big part of my personality to try to have a clear stand of where I am towards everything that's happening around me. But also, I think it is how to approach it. What is your goal at the end? What's the intention? What are we going to? So I think, like, for me, art and activism are the same thing. For me, my art is a certain kind of politics. How I deal with my body, how I deal with my dancing was not something in my environment. It was a statement to have a dance career. And it is this idea that how to be integrate and authentic in following your stance, but not to be cruel, not to be violent, not to be blind, not to be one-sided. Like if we are in a society, for example, operating through a justice system where you have a judge and where you have a certain rules and where you have like a certain kind of law enforcement at some point, how we can say that that is justice and how we can say that it's a hate for someone? How we can say that we stand for our morals or ethics or beliefs or however we want to say it, and we are blinded by our morals, ethics, or beliefs. So I think, I would like to try to take the right stand, in my opinion, for the right reason, in my opinion, with the most degree of empathy towards everyone, even the opponents in my cause. And sometimes it feels very unrealistic or it feels very poetic, but at the end I chose art to be my career. I didn't choose accounting, so that is also very unrealistic. So so I
Totally.
think, so we want to dance and make living. What is fictional than this,
Completely. Hey,
So
Shady,
I think it is also this idea. Yes, we are
finish.
solid, I know.
So go ahead, finish. Sorry for interrupting.
No, I know that, as I told you, I enjoy talking, so please stop me.
I think like we've been talking for almost 2 hours, and I feel like we've been covering a lot, and it also gives me a lot of motivation to have another conversation with you in the future. Maybe also like putting politics aside and really diving more into artistic conversations. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk and to share time, and just to let you know that you're always welcome at my place in Vienna. If you ever pop by,
Thank you.
it would be lovely to see you and to maybe share some studio time together.
This would be amazing. I'm really watching the group and the school that you have and everything. So
Cool. Thank you very much.
I
I wish you all the best of luck, and I hope to see you soon.
If you want to see more precious and insightful moments, make sure to check our short clips playlist. To see longer interviews, check out the full episode playlist just below it. And to be notified for all future videos, click the subscribe button and don't forget to hit the notification bell. See you on the next episode.